Welcome to this engineering meetup to celebrate Clojure turning 15. I'm so excited to have everyone here. It's incredible to see the chat, everyone from all over the world. And as is obvious from that chat, we cannot gather in one place to share the same birthday cake for Clojure. So the next best thing is to have a round table of the Clojure team and pepper them with questions. So I'll be your host. My name is Jaret Binford. I'm the product manager on the Datomic team, and I'm so excited to begin. I am going to introduce our guests here in chronological order as to their appearance on the Clojure scene, and we all know where that begins. It begins with the origin. Rich Hickey, the author of Clojure, the architect of Datomic, and a distinguished engineer here at Nubank. And then it's followed closely on the heels by Stu Holloway, the author of the first Clojure book, Programming Clojure, and a Datomic developer, and a distinguished engineer here at Nubank as well. And then also joining us is Alex Miller, principal software engineer here at Nubank, co-author of the second and third editions of Programming Clojure, and a Clojure maintainer. And finally, Michael Fogus, who everyone probably on this call, or many people on this call, know simply as Fogus, and he will be referred to as such throughout the rest of the call, who is a principal software engineer here at Nubank and the author of Joy of Clojure. And so I'm so excited to have everyone here, and we'll just jump right in and begin with questions. And Rich, you're my first target.
All right.
So how would you characterize your approach towards the stewardship of Clojure? And has that approach changed over time?
Well, I think the stewardship is about treating people the way I would want to be treated, in terms of having something stable that you can use to write, software and products that matter to you. And so I've always appreciated it when the tools I was using were stable, and that is absolutely the emphasis, and it has been and still is.
Stu, I've got to pick on you next. What was it that attracted you to Clojure? I know at the time, I think you were working on Ruby, and I wonder if your use of Ruby or Ruby and similar languages may have paved the way for a language like Clojure from your experience.
So I think it's important in a setting like this for me to mischaracterize the history of programming languages so that Rich pulls his hair out. So I'll try to do that. I happened to be working in Ruby professionally at the time that I discovered Clojure, but I think that the lineage of Clojure is a lot more in the straitjacketed languages that most of us had to work in, right? That people came up and learned C and C++, and then they learned Java or C#. Not to say that everybody was on those paths, but that most people were on those paths, and that Clojure provided an alternative to those choices that was production ready and suitable for use in environments where, specifically Java at the beginning, where people had used Java in the past. I do think it's really important that alternative languages of any kind of everything except for C, C++, Java, and C# and Visual Basic, all sort of together cracked that open, right? Created the headspace where people said, you know what, we don't all have to work the same way. And so for me, I mean, Ruby wasn't a gateway drug directly, but it was a permission, right? If you can build something not in C or C++ or Java or C#, then you could build it in Ruby, or you could build it in Python, or you could build it in Erlang or Clojure or whatever.
Alex, I'm going to pick on you next and build on that question from Stu. How do you think people's prior language experiences affect the questions and problems they have starting with Clojure?
Well, definitely, like, we've been running the State of Clojure survey for about a decade now, and it's amazing how consistent that history has been. When people come into Clojure, definitely the strongest cohort is people coming from Java, and they usually find it a breath of fresh air, but struggle with trying to make things that are the equivalent of classes and objects and doing those sorts of things. So they run to records and protocols, and a lot of time it's a matter of sort of pulling them back from that and introducing them to open maps and namespace-based attributes and a different way to think about our data. We certainly have a lot of people that come from dynamic languages like Ruby or Python or JavaScript, and those have all kind of ebbed and waned over the years, depending on what was hot in the industry and where we were making noise about things. They tend to have less problems with those things, more problems with other aspects of the language. And then interestingly, there's been always been a cohort that's coming from languages like C++ and are looking to do the kinds of heavy duty, math or science oriented programming that they did in that language, because Clojure is a lot easier to get started with. It's easier for, doing those kinds of, expressing those kinds of computations, but they have to know different kinds of things to get high performance or concurrency. And so I see them looking at those kinds of things. So.
Thanks for that. I am remiss as a host in my eagerness to talk about our birthday celebration. I forgot to point all of our guests to the interpretation option. So if you need interpretation on this call, it's the globe icon down in the bottom center. I've now gotten over my initial jitters of wanting to celebrate Clojure on its 15th birthday. It's Clojure's quinceañera that I now feel confident enough to ask Focus here a question. Focus, I believe you gave the first talk about Clojure's influence at the first conch, and lots happened since then. It's done its own, Clojure has done its own share of influencing. Could you maybe talk about what influence Clojure may have had or is having on software development?
Yeah, hi. I did give that first talk, and I, when I practiced it at home, it clocked in right around 30 minutes or so, but I was so nervous that I spoke so quickly that I finished in 18 minutes during the actual talk. And I tried to stretch out the questions, but I don't know how successful I was. But if I had had extra time and really incredible foresight, I could have talked about influences that Clojure would have had on programming. And Stu used an interesting word, permission, and I think that by putting some interesting ideas out into the wild, Clojure gave languages and language implementers and maintainers the permission to go deeper with functional programming and to integrate immutable and persistent data structures into their languages and explore things like sequence abstractions. I know that there's some chatter in Common Lisp or building libraries of sequence abstractions for use in Common Lisp, and even something as trivial as, say, destructuring is starting to find some wider adoption. And I don't know that Clojure directly influences languages, but it did contribute to an environment of an acceptance for those kinds of features and capabilities.
Rich, if backwards compatibility and other factors didn't matter, what would you add, remove, or change in Clojure?
I can't answer that question. It's sort of an inherent contradiction, because I think if those things didn't matter, if you would just like change a tool at will whenever, it's no longer a tool. I don't think Clojure could be Clojure if those things didn't matter. I mean, that's sort of part of what it means to be a tool somebody can, walk up to and reliably take out and have some expectations about what it's going to do. So yeah, I can't imagine that universe. You know me and whatever it's called, multiverses. I only have one verse, and my verse Clojure is the way it is.
There's only one verse. I think that your answer touches on a question I wanted to get down to later, but Alex, you created a chart a while ago. I think, I forget what you called it, the survivability chart in your first tweet about it, and it made it into the Hopple paper that Rich wrote, and it shows all the lines of code, which I can actually, let me just share my screen and show you, if I can. It shows all the lines of code that have kind of stuck around in the Clojure code base. And I wanted to hear from you about what that chart meant to you, and maybe just have you talk about it for a minute, because I think it's a cool chart.
Sure. It's to me, the important thing is that, it's an additive model. The cool thing about code, like sometimes people ask me how do you refactor this code base? And my answer is I don't refactor it. It's already factored. The cool thing about Clojure is that you can add new things without having to go change all the other stuff that you already have. So, and that's not accidental. That's like intentionally built into the design of how Clojure works, and these like open polymorphism and using open maps and using namespaced attributes and using those kinds of tools are designed to make a system that grows with you over time. And that is what you see in the chart. We're not going in and deleting code, we're adding new features to it, but those are, just new chunks on top. And that in my experience, that is largely how it feels to work on the Clojure code base. And other, not just, and the Clojure language itself is maybe an extreme example of this. But it's how it feels to me to work on other Clojure code bases too. So it's not, although they might be a little more, slumpy.
Sure. Stu, I wanted to ask you, a lot of time has passed since you wrote the first edition of Programming Clojure. Is there anything that you've learned since that you believe would be useful to newcomers to Clojure?
So I appreciate, Jaret, how you're low-key implying that maybe I didn't learn anything in like approximately 15 years. So I think that, this point has already been made several times here, but I'll say it again, the importance of programming with generosity to others, with growth and compatible change over time was certainly something I did not appreciate enough in my early days and my early involvement with Clojure stewardship. But I think the other one that really jumps out is the importance of an interactive environment for exploring ideas, and the importance of having that environment be the same environment that you use to ship production code. So if I'm exploring something that is completely unknown to me, I'll sit down and open a Clojure REPL. And if I'm writing code to ship to production, I will work in very similar ways in much the same REPL. And I think that is one of the slowest things people come to in Clojure, that they adopt IDE and project and files and all the trappings that they're used to seeing in other languages. And those are important, but it's also important to embrace the REPL and to really live interactively.
This is kind of a question for the whole panel, so anyone feel free to jump in. I wanted to ask a question about the JVM impact in the performance of Clojure. Do we, or does the Clojure team rewrite code when the JVM is updated? What is that interaction like?
I think most people would want us to rewrite it more. So I think Rich's approach has always been to be extremely conservative about taking on new features of the JVM, because they tend to take many releases to sort of settle down and be like, once they're invoke dynamic and things like that. He was very, very hesitant to take on that feature when it first came out. Watching JRuby and how other languages, went through a lot of churn as they tried to adapt to that and make it work and deal with its negative impacts in the early days. Now I think it's, now that it's used by Java and is, sort of part of the way other features are used, I don't think it has those issues anymore. But with, I've seen other JVM languages that tend to, require a bunch of options and certain versions and all that. And I've always found it extremely refreshing that Clojure had no extra JVM options you had to apply, and worked on all the versions of Java that anybody reasonably used, and all that kind of stuff. And so I appreciate that. Maybe Rich has a different answer.
Yeah, well, I think the other side of it is that while we haven't necessarily chased after Java features, neither have we been forced to rewrite things to accommodate changes in Java. Java has a similar don't break things stewardship model. And we certainly, I mean, that's a value prop for me. That's why, I chose the JVM as the dominant platform, because it doesn't force us around. I would say that, we look forward to sort of surveying the latest enhancements and maybe doing a release of Clojure that is specifically pointed at adopting some of them where it would really matter for Clojure. But I think it's to everybody's benefit that no one's being dragged around or forced into change by Clojure or Java or the JVM.
Great. I have another question for the whole panel. Imagining that there's 1,000 good ideas, and there often are, for a feature in a programming language, how do you as a team work together to narrow those down to the ideas that you end up deciding to implement in the language?
I'll pose this as I'll start a sentence, and everybody who's on the call, you can turn on their mic and say the same word at the same time. We don't work on features, we work on
Problems.
problems, right? You've got to get back to the underlying problem. Oftentimes many feature requests will end up being solved in other ways, and some of them will connect together in surprising ways to whatever the underlying problem turns out to be.
I'm glad you spoke up for that question, Stu, because I also wanted to ask you, how has using Clojure been while you're building a system like Datomic?
So I think that there are a couple of different facets to it, or maybe 3 different facets to it. One of them is that, building something like a database, you need to have, the raw performance of whatever your underlying platform is, and that's just table stakes. And so there are a lot of languages that deliver that, not all, and Clojure does. So that's an important thing, right? There's not like, half of Datomic is written in Java or some other language where it needs to be fast. Another facet is having an environment for exploring ideas in the context of a partially working system. And that's a fantastic thing, right? Being able to be at the REPL and say, I have these 4 pieces that already work and these 3 pieces that I'm thinking about how they might work, and quickly be able to sort of switch things around and try things out. And then the other facet is be able to do the same thing, right? That code that's written in the REPL become the production code. So I see it in sort of 3 levels, right? You have a performance bar that you have to meet. That's a checklist item. And then there's the expressivity in the development process and the expressivity in code that you can go to production with, and having those be as close together as possible is extremely valuable.
This is another question for the whole panel. In your view, what would any of you say is the most misunderstood, maybe that's the wrong word, or underappreciated adopted feature of Clojure? If there's no answers, I can, if no one wants to touch that question. Okay,
I think Stu mentioned it earlier. We do see a lot of people coming to Clojure who have workflows they're familiar with, either from other languages or have sort of been put in place to deliver, to have delivery systems that are oriented around write, tests, ship, watch CI. and are not substantially interactive. And I think that there's far more opportunities to leverage the interactive environment, to work in a program with your data loaded, to do the kinds of development Stu's been talking about. And it's frequently the case that we don't see that. We see people using REPLs to sort of demo, oh, look, you can start Clojure and add 1 and 2 and 3, but not really the deep, I am working inside my program. I'm building my program from the inside out. I'm having it grow while it's still running. And even more, interacting with running systems, enhancing systems in production and things like that. And I think that not only do people do less of that than they could, but as a community, we could do more to sort of pursue those kinds of things, which were even done a lot better and more extensively by the systems of old, the old Lisp and Smalltalk systems. So interactive development is a feature that never stops delivering, and I think we all could continue to explore it.
I'm glad you mentioned Lisp and Smalltalk. I have a question on here for Fogus. Fogus, I wanted to ask you, you have like an encyclopedic knowledge of various programming languages. And I just wanted to know, do you think that Clojure's lived up to the promise of the environments of Lisp and Smalltalk? Or?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, because I think that the levers that that Clojure provides are the same levers that say Lisp provides. I think that we as the Clojure community haven't perhaps pulled those levers as hard as we should have, and I say that we've talked about it. It's been mentioned numerous times on this panel that there is a way that Clojure and as a Lisp provides us to connect to our running program, and in a way that Lisp and Smalltalk environments did by rote. And so I think that we can push harder on that angle. And I think that even my own chosen development environment could be better, and it just doesn't feel the same as, say, using a Smalltalk environment, or even, say, an old common Lisp IDE does. And I wanted to get there.
Yeah. Alex, how would you describe the Clojure community, and what does fostering that community mean for Clojure?
Well, I think Rich mentioned earlier, working, providing a tool that people want to work with, and I think he started the Clojure community with the same idea in mind, that this is about people coming together to solve problems and to make a tool that we all want to use. And hopefully that spirit continues today. The Clojure community has gone through all sorts of different technologies and things like that. There's still a lot of people from the early days that are active in the community and that I still talk to on a regular basis and see at conferences and talk to online, things like that. And I think Clojure developers are always looking for how to make the way that they work better, and how to and are interested in new ideas. And sometimes I see people grouse about, oh, now there's you made a new thing, and now there's 2 ways to do it, and to me that's not a problem. That's how we make progress and trying to do new things. And I also think the Clojure community is very kind. When you see the Slack, the Clojurian Slack, or you see other places like the Clojure Reddit, or there's a bunch of places where Clojurians get together and talk, and in general I find them to be amazingly welcoming and interested in helping new people. And it is not, there are other language communities where you are just people will be snide to you and, oh, why don't you know this or that? I don't see that attitude in the Clojure community at all. So it's great. I can't wait to have the next Clojure Conj, which we've been a few years away from it. That's coming up at the end of April in 2023. And we're very much looking forward to seeing the community again. And I think we're gonna, this is not a guarantee, but I think we're working towards having streaming access for that. So the community will be able to participate remotely as well. So looking forward to seeing everybody in person again. It's been a long time, been too long.
Yeah, that's I think that's the 27th and the 28th of April. And maybe we'll try to have a cake and a virtual cake there too. So I have another question for you, Stu. I know that you've spent a lot of time troubleshooting Datomic support cases because that's what you and I do during the day. And I wanted to know how, working through community and user reported problems has influenced your design sensibilities or maybe your problem solving.
Well, I think the important thing I would say about this is that I find troubleshooting to be the easiest part of my job, and other people express that it's difficult. And so it's interesting to explore, why that happens. And I think that, I've given talks about applying Sherlock Holmes to troubleshooting, but just to summarize a few ideas here, and maybe with different words, capture the facts without interpretation or judgment. And that is a simple sentence, but it's actually quite hard to do. And quite often, if you go back and look at what you just wrote down, you can say, you know what? There's an implied judgment in there, and there's an underlying fact, and separate those apart. And then iteratively try to find explanations that cover the facts, and try to ask questions that divide the world in half, right? You can go down this branch or that branch, as opposed to like pairing off some tiny portion of the space. And admittedly, that requires, sometimes some domain knowledge. But both of those tasks require setting aside your ego, right? You get attached to what you just said, and it's amazing how quickly, as humans, we are programmed to do that. And I do it all the time, and I'm still bad at it. But it's a mechanical exercise to go back and say, no, that's that explanation. I really liked it. I really felt smart when I came up with it. But one of the 12 facts contradicts it, so it's dead. And you have to move on. That's the scientific method. And a lot of troubleshooting in a support context, the work Jaret and I sometimes are doing on Datomic, is helping somebody do that, or doing it for them, or meeting them somewhere while things are going very badly in their world, right? So there's this sense of something is really not right. I don't know exactly what it is, and people often use the expression "on fire." I think that's a really dangerous metaphor, because if you're on fire, you really should stop and roll around and deal with that. But even when things are really, really bad in a software situation, you should be thinking carefully and writing things down. So I really enjoy that part of my job hugely, and I find that it is more mechanical. It's much easier than design, right? It's very mechanical, right? Once you start playing a game for a while, and there are some mechanical tricks you can use to improve design, but it requires much more. It's kind of the opposite skill in some ways, right? Design is really stepping back and abstracting, and a lot of troubleshooting is concreting, right? Stopping yourself from abstracting and going in and saying, what exactly happened and what would explain it?
Rich, do you see an area of computing where Clojure has not been explored and would greatly benefit from the advantages of Clojure?
Well, I think certainly one of the hot areas where work is happening, especially in the community, would be data science. I think that Clojure has a lot of great ideas and a lot of great characteristics that are suitable for data science. And while Python certainly has a head start, a lot of the things you see in Python are not, as rigorous and functional as we have from Clojure. And a lot of people in data science are struggling with, repeatability and things where I think Clojure could really provide some interesting and different strategies. So that would be an area I'd like to see more. And of course, people are working on it, and I think they're doing some great stuff. But Clojure could be a great data science language for sure.
This is another question for the whole panel. What points would you offer for consideration to an organization that may be hesitant to use Clojure because they feel, it might be difficult to find talent.
I think it has, go ahead, Alex. I'll let you do this.
I was going to say, it's just funny to me in the Clojure survey every year that it's frequently a top issue that people ask about hiring, and it's also a top issue that people ask about wanting to get hired. So it's just one of these things where when you have a less ubiquitous technology, the distribution of talent and jobs is not necessarily equal. There are people out there wanting to work in Clojure, and there are people wanting to hire Clojurists, and they're not necessarily geographically or culturally aligned, unfortunately. But one thing that I would like to encourage companies to do is, if the value propositions of Clojure are interesting to you, to hire people who are good developers and teach them Clojure, because it's not hard to learn Clojure. And Nubank is an excellent example of that. We hire hundreds of developers every year and teach them Clojure, and that's a much easier path, I think, than trying to hire an expert Clojure developer necessarily. I don't know if Stu had anything to add.
Well, I mean, when we were running a consultancy, we would get this question a lot, right? We would say, we're going to build your thing in what we thought was the best way to build it. And people would ask, well, what happens when you leave? And I mean, a lot of it depends on, how big a problem you're taking on, right? If you're taking on a small problem with a small time scale, and possibly a solution that you will throw away in a year, it kind of doesn't matter how you do it, right? And picking the most commoditized approach to solving it is the right way to go. If you're trying to do something challenging, that's going to have a longer life cycle, then investing a little bit up front in more leverage is going to pay you off, week in and week out, month in and month out, as you continue to build. I think there's for me, kind of a tipping point question, which is, if you see IT as a source of competitive advantage for your company, then you should be looking at things like Clojure, right? Even if not Clojure, something that claims to be off the beaten path. And if you see IT as a commodity, or really just a source of problems, or something you want to just control the cost of and move on, then maybe not. And I think that IT is eating the world. So the vast majority, there are a lot of companies out there that claim that they see IT as a competitive advantage. And then I think we can, challenge in that setting to say, okay, what does it mean to do that? And how do you go about approaching IT as a source of competitive advantage?
I think I actually have a good example of this from the company I was at prior to working on Clojure itself. And we built some products in Clojure. And when I started at that job, one of my requirements was that they hired me to do some, product design, architecture type stuff. And one of my requests was that I'd be able to pick the language that I was going to use. And this is in the 2009, 10-ish era. And at that point, I had spent decades working in Java already, and we had other Java products. So it was going to be a JVM based language. And we were considering both Scala and Clojure, and started building a product and hiring people at the same time. And I hired a bunch of people, none of whom knew Clojure or Scala. And we did a lot of, trying things, and decided that we were getting way more leverage out of Clojure, and dove into using Clojure. And none of us had used Clojure before, including me. And I was leading the team. And it was, for me, one of the things I was looking for was, I had built a query engine before. I was going to build another query engine. I knew where I had run into hitting the wall with that in the past, and really wanted something that was more data focused and better able to make abstractions. And I found that with Clojure. And I had no regrets about making that choice after working on it for 2 or 3 years after that. That I had lots of problems, but those weren't it. So they weren't problems with Clojure. There were problems with domain and product and selling things and all those kinds of things. But and it was a huge selling point to hire really talented people that were going to go work on this problem space and not be inhibited by the language they were using, but get to use a language that was really a joy to use and could work really interactively and solve hard problems. So it was a huge hiring point for us. And I don't remember ever being an issue as far as, building and selling the product. There were other problems with that. But,
The 2009, 2010 era, that's like around when 1.2 was released, which was protocols and records. I'd actually written down a question about that release because I thought it stuck out in the history of Clojure paper as a point, as an important release. And I wanted to know why this panel thinks that that was important to have protocols and records.
I don't know if those were critical features necessarily, but there was just a level of polishing that had happened by that point where I didn't need anything else. I had everything that I needed. And you really didn't need records for a lot of stuff or protocols for a lot of stuff, but certainly protocols are nice to have when you're doing certain things as an open extensibility mechanism. But I think that was kind of where we hit sort of a, this is we don't really need anything else to make, real systems at this point.
Yeah, another way to look at that same question is if I had to choose a language today and all of the history after Clojure 1.2 was erased, I would choose Clojure 1.2 as my language today, right? It has that sort of, it covers the basis of what you need to build software.
I wrote down another question that was originally directed for Rich, but I think it's an all question. People talk about the elegance of Clojure, and I wanted to hear what you think that means.
Well, I know what it ought to mean. But what people mean when they say it, I'm not sure. Elegance is sort of a measure of election, of choice. When you say something's elegant, what you're saying hopefully is that it reflects good choices. And I think that sometimes that's just a subjective thing and sort of co-aligned taste. I think it's elegant because it meets my own ideas somewhere. And there's another sense in which it means choices were made, that it's smaller, it's not everything, it's some subset of things, it's some carving through the space of all ideas and all choices that is somewhat minimal and complete and sufficient. We were just talking about the sufficiency of 1.2 to get things done. And because choices were made, it's small enough that you can see and understand those choices and sort of load the whole thing in your head. And hopefully that's one of the appeals of Clojure, is that it's small enough to fit in your head comfortably, leaving room for whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. So that's what I'd hope for, but I'm sure everybody has their own ideas.
I'm glad you gave us a taste of the word origins there, because you kind of gave us a great definition of elegance. And you're well known for your interest in word origins, Rich. And I just wanted to ask, how has that helped you, and how do you think that can help others?
Well, it's a great way to make a conference talk. Yeah, I think what's fun about word origins is that the words are often composite. They're a glomming together of a part that means some prepositional thing, and another part which is some really primitive idea. And I think to the extent that our language captures and sort of has a lineage of these primitive ideas that flow through the variations of words, is great because it allows us sometimes to sort of take a step back and say, if we pull this apart, either find a word or maybe looking for a word, playing the name game in the early days of Clojure was fun because it forces you to say, what is the idea that underlies this thing? It's not like nicknaming. Nicknaming is not the same as like good naming. Good naming is about finding words that mean the right thing. And, if you're going to try to have some consensus about what words mean, well, you need dictionaries and thesauruses and some sort of continuity across time about what words mean, which I sort of value a lot, although these days I think it's less valued. People just make words.
So I have an open-ended question here too that's for the team. I think maybe Alex might have some ideas, but it's incredible that we're on this call and there's people from all over the world who've joined us in the chat. But what do you think as the Clojure team could be done to broaden the reach of Clojure to appeal to more people?
Well, when people are looking for things, I mean, this is a topic that comes up all the time in Clojure, and I'm not sure if that's unique to Clojure. I'm just immersed in it, and so it feels like it's all the time. Or if it's because people love Clojure, they want more people to do it. I don't know, but I think that the foundations of that are really to do cool stuff in Clojure and tell people about it. But I think the thing that we've talked about internally a lot is that the Clojure community is very good at talking to the Clojure community about Clojure, and not very good about talking to the non-Clojure community about Clojure. And so I think that's something where Rich did a ton of that because everybody was the non-Clojure community in the early days. And so he did a ton of work going to Java conferences and Ruby conferences and, all these places all over. He doesn't do as much of that anymore because it's really tiring. So all of us, on the Clojure team have done a lot of speaking and that sort of thing, and know exactly how tiring it is to travel and speak and prepare talks and do all that kind of stuff. And so none of us do as much of that as we used to. So that's unfortunate. Hopefully we can continue to apply more resources in that area, and hopefully it's an excellent place where the community can help. There are lots of younger people with more energy than us for that sort of thing. And so I would encourage all of you to get out there and go talk at, the big Clojure conference, or the big Java conference, or the big technology conference where people may not have heard about Clojure. And it's like Rich said about data science earlier, Clojure is an amazing language for data science. It's all about data. It's got, it's a tragedy that we've locked this away in Python and things like that, which I think is just nowhere near as good for talking about data. So the more we can do in those kinds of areas, I think that there's just tons of things tons of places that we could go that people aren't even familiar with us. So
Bogus, I had a question that I meant to ask you earlier that I'm looking at my sheet of questions that I thought out before. I wanted to know how your views on Clojure have changed as you transition from an external contributor to an internal maintainer, and what that experience has been like for you.
Yeah, so I'd say that coming into the team here, I came in as a person who was a programming languages dweeb. And so those 1,000 great ideas that you were talking about, I wanted them all. But it really has been eye-opening to see the discipline that this team goes about tackling problems, right? We're problem-oriented. And previously as a consultant, I would say that I was solving problems, but probably more often than not, I was fixing symptoms, symptom-oriented programming. And so I think that just seeing the way that the disciplined approach to the way that Clojure is enhanced and maintained has been extremely eye-opening to me. And I will say that as a core contributor, it's 20,000 times more terrifying to make changes now than it used to be. And that's a good thing, right? It should be terrifying to make changes at the language level. And it should be hard, and it should be thoughtful.
So I have another open-ended question that I think serves really well to just kind of wrap up this conversation. But where do you all see Clojure in the next 5 years, or where do you hope to see it? Other than back here with me on another one of these.
I think Rich should take that one.
Well, I'd like to see more people use Clojure and more great things being built in it. You know, the storytelling aspect, I think, is critical. Alex talked about, you know, radiating to other communities that aren't aware of Clojure. But, you know, Clojure is popular with startups because startups are willing to, you know, take the risk of something novel in order to get the benefit of, you know, superior leverage. And, you know, there are so many people who could benefit from that. And so there's so much potential for growth. So I'd love to see Clojure grow substantially in the next 5 years as a community, as a set of users. As a language, I'd like to see it stay small, and I'd like to see the growth of Clojure into other areas be dominated by libraries. I mean, it is a Lisp, it's supposed to be small. So I don't see a lot of, you know, features being added over time. But I see the application domains in which it's applied growing over time. The number of successful companies being built in it will increase over time. And the amount of the stories people can tell, I think, will increase over time. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Okay, I think it's been a celebration. I had a little bit of focus, and I did my, you know, hour-long set of questions in 13 minutes or whatever your record was. But I really appreciate having you all here. I am really grateful for the whole community. Like it was mentioned on here, this is a loving community, and everyone who contributes on Reddit or Clojurian Slack or any of the places where Clojure is gathered, you've had a part of this. And so thank you. And I look forward to many more years of celebration and seeing everyone at Conj April 27th, 28th. And then when this meeting closes, which I don't know when it'll happen, there will be a feedback form that we'd encourage you guys to give us some feedback. You can probably tell me to ask more questions. That would probably be good. And then we will post this video on the Building New YouTube channel. So this talk will be there. So we really appreciate everyone coming out, and thank you to Rich and Stu and Alex and Fogus for making the time to answer some questions.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.